Notorious Glasgow gangster Paul Ferris today said thank you to Strathclyde police, claiming it was because of them that a film is now to be made about his life. Ferris, who was jailed for gun running 8 years ago, was back in Glasgow to meet actor Robert Carlyle, who's expected to play him in the movie.
I'd like to thank certain members of Strathclyde Police for the opportunity to enhance my particular different path in life.
What about the film itself? Will you be involved in it and advising?
I don't know yet. I don't know at all. I'm just turned up to speak to the film crew. And
30 years ago, Paul Ferris was cleared of the murder of Arthur Thompson Sr. But in 1998, he was found guilty of gun running at the Old Bailey. Now, Robert Carlyle is set to play Ferris.
Though the actor was today reluctant to discuss the film.
The fact is, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen anyway.
How soon?
How soon? I don't know how soon. Hopefully not too soon.
In the brutal streets of Glasgow, violence was the currency of power. Young men clawed their way to the top, earning their stripes through stabbings and shootings, desperate for a reputation. But none became more feared than one: Paul Ferris. As an enforcer for the notorious Thompson crime family, a syndicate that ruled Glasgow's criminal world with brutality, Ferris built his name through cold-blooded precision. But unlike many gangsters, Paul Ferris wasn't driven by money. If anything fueled his rise, it was revenge. A cold, calculated thirst for payback and blood transformed him into a monster, one who could stab and maim without so much as a backward glance. Not the type of behavior you'd expect from a seemingly well-spoken and articulate individual, but Paul Ferris, aka the Wee Man, is the epitome of the saying to never judge a book by its cover. From violent gang wars to high-profile trials, this is the story of Paul Ferris. His rise from the gritty streets of Glasgow to becoming one of Scotland's most feared criminals. Paul Ferris was born on November 10, 1963, at 19 Hogganfield Street in Blackhill, one of Glasgow's many post-war housing estates. These estates, built in the 1950s, were intended to provide a fresh start for working-class families. But instead, they became breeding grounds for crime and violence. Blackhill, like neighboring areas such as Easterhouse, Balornick, and Garthamlock, evolved into ghettos where mob rule flourished. The estates, with their cold, gray concrete and overcrowded conditions, quickly fostered a subculture of survival. Families poured in, trapped like animals in a cage, and a new kind of law began to take hold, one ruled by violence. While most residents were decent, hard-working people, they couldn't escape the rising tide of crime that surrounded them. Gangs emerged, territorial disputes flared, and the streets became battlegrounds where respect was earned through fear. Bullies thrived, extorting and terrorizing those too weak to defend themselves. It was within this harsh, unforgiving environment that Paul Ferris came of age, shaped by a world where toughness was the only way to survive. Ferris grew up with the shadow of crime looming over his family. His father, often in and out of prison, left Paul's mother to keep a tight hold on her youngest son. Despite the turbulence, his early years were relatively calm. He stayed out of trouble and spent his days learning how to plant vegetables with his grandfather, surrounded by the comforting smells of furniture polish and coal fires in their home. But that security was fleeting. When his grandfather passed away and his father was jailed for tax evasion, Ferris's world began to unravel. At St. Philomena's primary school, the brutality of Glasgow's streets crept into his childhood. It was there that 9-year-old Ferris first encountered the Welsh brothers, a notorious gang of bullies. Standing up to the ringleader, Martin Welsh, in a fight seemed like a moment of defiance, but it brought harsh consequences. The next day, Martin's 7 older brothers cornered Ferris in the schoolyard. He was beaten mercilessly and forced to fight Martin again, a fight he couldn't possibly win. I really had enjoyed school until I became a victim of those Welsh brothers. It was at that stage in my life that my mind was opened up to a different world to which I had been taught. I was becoming aware that I was rapidly leaving my infancy and entering an altogether differing state of reality. The Welsh brothers had made him their target, and no matter how hard the hits came, he never ran. He stood his ground, enduring the pain while his friends watched helplessly. Crying was never an option, but the violence continued, day after day. As Ferris prepared to leave primary school, the toll became more than just physical. The unrelenting stress triggered a violent reaction in his body: psoriasis. His skin, like his nerves, began to break under the weight of fear. fear of facing the older Welsh brothers in secondary school, fear of what awaited him next. The anxiety pushed him to the point of hospitalization, where he was wrapped in bandages from head to toe, smeared with creams that left him feeling humiliated and degraded. It was a far cry from the tough exterior he tried to maintain in the schoolyard. When he arrived at St. Roch's Secondary School, he felt like half a human being. His body covered in seeping sores, he avoided gym classes, football, and swimming, ashamed of what he saw in the mirror. I never got to wear a t-shirt in the summer months because I never liked what I saw on my bare arms, and if I didn't like it, then no one else was going to see it. I became accustomed to psoriasis, but never fully recovered psychologically. It etched something fierce and lasting into my brain. The stigma of being denied normality. The standoff with the Welsh brothers continued, and they couldn't comprehend how the skinny 13-year-old Paul Ferris always stood his ground. Despite their relentless bullying, Ferris never backed down, even when outnumbered and faced with the sheer brutality of their attacks. One day, the Welsh brothers demanded money from Ferris and a group of boys, but Paul, as usual, refused to give in. What followed was one of their most vicious assaults yet. Armed with a hammer, they set upon the young Ferris, as his friends could only watch helplessly. But to everyone's astonishment, something strange happened. Ferris started laughing. Through every blow, through the pain and the blood, he erupted into laughter. It was a maniacal, uncontrollable sound that echoed through the close. The Welsh brothers, expecting fear and submission, were instead met with laughter. With each strike, Ferris just laughed harder, nerving his attackers. They couldn't make sense of his reaction, and soon, their confidence began to waver. The more Ferris laughed, the more unsettled they became. Eventually, their rising fear got the better of them. They stopped the attack and walked away, confused and shaken by Ferris's passive defiance. When he finally stumbled out of the close, drenched in blood, he had a grin on his face. His friends, shocked by the scene, struggled to understand how he could find humor in such a brutal beating. But for Ferris, this was more than a moment of survival. It was a turning point. Despite the blood and the pain, he made a vow, a promise to himself and his friend Eddie. No matter how long it took, he would get revenge on each and every one of the Welsh brothers for what they had done to him that day. The brothers had tried to break him, but they soon realized that they couldn't subdue the wee man who laughed in the face of their violence. Now, they faced a problem they hadn't anticipated, a young boy who refused to be crushed by fear or beatings. Their solution? To eliminate the threat they couldn't control. The final solution for the Welsh brothers was simple: get rid of the one they could never defeat. Word spread quickly through Blackhill. There was a boy hanging from a tree in the local cemetery. A crowd rushed to the scene, and when they arrived, they found a semi-conscious Paul Ferris dangling from a noose. He was swiftly cut down, barely alive. The story circulated, and people soon realized the truth behind the incident. Ferris, who had been standing up to the local bullies and damaging their reputations, had become too much of a threat. The Welsh brothers, embarrassed by his defiance and relentless challenges to their dominance, decided it was time to send a message. Ferris needed to be made an example of, and in their minds, hanging him was the ultimate way to reclaim control over Blackhill. As the rumors died down, the incident was dismissed by many as a boyhood prank gone wrong. But those who truly knew the situation understood otherwise. This was no accident. The Welsh brothers had intended to silence Ferris for good, hoping that his death would restore their unquestioned rule over the area. They had hung him, fully expecting him to take his last breath that day. But Ferris survived, and the door for retribution was left wide open. Although Ferris has never spoken about that day, those closest to him know what followed. He acted on it, with a vengeance that shook those responsible to their core. This moment was a turning point, not just in his personal vendetta, but in his path into the criminal world. Before Ferris could seek his full revenge, however, he had another task ahead of him: to graduate into the life of crime that would eventually bring him power and fortune. His first taste of crime came when he and his friends rolled lead off the roof of a bookmaker's and sold it for scrap. The score earned him hundreds of pounds, an easy fortune for a young boy. But despite this early success in crime, Ferris took a normal job after leaving school to please his mother. He began working at a Glasgow brewery, proud to be bringing home £180 a week, a solid wage for a man his age. But the lure of crime was always there. His friends had formed a smash-and-grab syndicate, targeting jewelers across Glasgow. The payouts were too tempting to ignore, £500 or more for just one job. It didn't take long for Ferris to realize that the long hours of hauling crates of whiskey up 6 floors in a broken-down barrow couldn't compare to the fast money waiting in the underworld. Moving deeper into crime soon brought Ferris into the penal system for the first time. He and a friend were caught trying to rob a travel agent in Airdrie, Lanarkshire, as they attempted to steal cash from the night safe. Ferris found himself at Long Rigand Remand Unit, where the short, sharp shock treatment did little to change his path. If anything, it sharpened his resolve. To establish himself and deter any potential bullies, Ferris slashed a fellow inmate with an open razor, a brutal warning to anyone who might challenge him. On the outside, his reputation as a fearless young criminal only grew. His first act of revenge came when he encountered John Welsh, one of the tormentors from his past. As Welsh walked down the street, Ferris slashed him from ear to ear, sending a message to any Welshes who were unfortunate enough to cross him. As I was about to walk past him, I turned. Opening my razor, I sliced him right across his face from ear to ear. I walked smartly on, leaving him in his blood-soaked garments, clutching his wounded face and battered pride as he fell heavily into the gutter where he and his like belonged. He never saw me, and no one ever found out who had inflicted the wounds that night until months later. When Ferris wasn't fighting or stabbing, he was honing his criminal skills, robbing jewelers and moving guns for other criminals. But as his notoriety grew, so did the time he spent behind bars. His first significant stint, a 12-month sentence at Glenochil Young Offenders Institution, gave him a new stage to assert his dominance. Inside Glenochil, Ferris found a new circle to run with: the Glenochil Wolves. This sadistic group of inmates thrived on violence, and Ferris fit right in. It was there that he found real power and an outlet for his violent urges. Between 1981 and 1984, a wave of suicides among sex offenders led to a government inquiry. What outsiders didn't know was that the Wolves, including Ferris, had orchestrated a campaign to drive these offenders to take their own lives. Ferris later admitted to witnessing the orchestrated torment, which led to the suicides of at least 10 prisoners. Among the victims was Raymond Gilmore, a man who had always protested his innocence in the Pamela Hasty murder case. Despite his claims, Gilmore was repeatedly tortured by the Wolves. Ferris recalled how Gilmore and other sex offenders were regularly beaten in the prison's textile workshop, with wolves taking turns to strike them with pieces of wood or iron bars. One of the most brutal attacks Ferris witnessed was carried out by a young thug named Big Eck. Eager to prove himself to the Wolves, Eck nearly killed a sex offender by smashing an industrial sewing machine onto his head in full view of other inmates. The assault earned Eck his place among the Wolves, marking a chilling moment in Ferris's time at Glenochil. By 1987, Ferris was back in prison, serving a 3-year sentence for firearms offenses. During his time there, the prison saw riots and unrest, much of which was driven by inmates' fury towards sex offenders. Ferris described one incident during a riot in Shotts Prison, where inmates took control of a guard's keys and opened the cells of sex offenders, dragging them out one by one for violent judgment. Though Ferris didn't participate directly in the beatings, he watched as the offenders were brutally punished by their fellow inmates. His involvement in the riots came to an end when he negotiated the release of a prison officer held hostage. Though many inmates were sentenced for their roles in the uprising, Ferris escaped prosecution by serving as a Crown witness. After his release from prison, he returned to the streets of Glasgow. Now fully entrenched in the criminal world, he was welcomed back into the fold by the Arthur Thompson regime, the most brutal crime family in Scotland. As the enforcer for Glasgow's Gangland godfather, Arthur Thompson Sr, Paul Ferris quickly built a reputation for extreme violence. He maimed and shot those who dared to stand in his way, carving his name into the city's criminal underworld. By the age of 19, Ferris was ready to step into the big leagues of organized crime. Thompson Sr had been watching Ferris closely, recognizing his potential as a valuable asset in his empire of drug dealing, car theft, and loan sharking. His quick, brutal methods made him an ideal enforcer. Thrilled by the attention from the man who styled himself as Glasgow's mafia boss, Ferris embarked on a reign of violence that would mark his name for years to come. But this alliance, built on blood, would eventually spiral into tragedy and betrayal, culminating in the death of his boss's son, Arthur Thompson Sr. During this period, I was totally unaware of the actual mayhem that I was causing throughout the city by being soaked in this blind loyalty to the Thompsons. If they asked me to injure, petrol bomb, or shoot people, then this I willingly did without question. For indeed, I was utterly infatuated by their success and their wealth, and I, for one, desperately wanted to be part of it. One of his early assignments as an enforcer was to recover £50,000 after the Thompson family was duped in a drug deal. An Irish gangster had conned young Arthur Thompson in a transaction involving 2 kilograms of cocaine. The cash was exchanged, and the drugs handed over in a sealed sports bag, but when the bag was opened, it contained nothing more than a bottle of iron brew and 2 bricks. Ferris, along with his partner Tam Bagan, was brought in to retrieve the money. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't recover the cash. Seeking revenge, the Thompsons left a car with a Kalashnikov rifle outside the Irishman's flat and tipped off the police. The failed deal became the talk of Glasgow's underworld, and Ferris took it upon himself to restore the family's reputation by roughing up a few people involved. In one instance, while searching for a target in an East End pub, Ferris struck a man over the head with a baseball bat, mistaking him for someone else. A scuffle broke out, and reacting instinctively, Ferris stabbed 2 men in the chaos. Violence was mounting nightly, and the police were taking notice. A few days later, Ferris and young Arthur Thompson spotted another debtor while driving through the city. Without hesitation, Thompson pulled out a Magnum revolver, rolled down the window, and fired at the man they were chasing. Such was the force of the penetration that the bullet entered the back of the vehicle. It plowed its way through metal and fabric into the back of the driver and out through his stomach, leaving him with life-changing injuries. The Thompson regime was making it clear that anyone who crossed them would pay a steep price. Ferris's early days working for the Thompson Empire played out like a scene from Goodfellas. Deception, drug deals gone wrong, shootings, and police informants were all part of the daily grind. As Arthur Thompson Sr.'s loyal enforcer, Ferris found himself deep in a world of mafia-style operations that left a trail of violence and death in its wake. Ferris admitted he was captivated by Thompson's wealth and power, and though he occasionally questioned the brutal tasks he was ordered to carry out, his desire to be part of the empire always won out. He participated fully in a world where shootings were routine, and even police officers were complicit in the Thompson regime's activities. Thompson Sr. had a close relationship with corrupt members of the police, often feeding them information in exchange for their protection. He controlled much of Glasgow's criminal underworld, knowing about every stolen item and transaction that passed through the city. In return for keeping the authorities informed, the police turned a blind eye, even helping him launder illicit profits through legitimate businesses. Ferris's role often involved recovering money for the family, including one instance where £50,000 had been stolen during a drug deal. The Thompsons tasked Ferris with saving their reputation, leading to a spree of beatings and stabbings as he sought revenge. One incident came to a head at a set of traffic lights when Ferris spotted a man who had supposedly threatened to shoot him. Seizing the moment, Ferris attacked, stabbing the man repeatedly before being bitten by the man's dog, which he also proceeded to stab in self-defense. The man later identified Ferris to the police, but Paul soon learned that the entire situation had been manipulated by the Thompsons. The supposed threat had never been made. Ferris had been used to settle a score. His violent reputation played like a pawn in the family's deadly game. The experience soured Ferris, and seeds of distrust began to take root. He realized that, to the Thompsons, he was nothing more than a hired hand, used to execute their twisted vendettas. No matter how loyal or brutal his actions, he would never be more than a tool to fulfill their violent ambitions. Shortly after, Ferris found himself questioning just how far the Thompsons would push him. Arthur Thompson Jr. had been arrested after a 60-mile police chase, during which officers witnessed him throwing packets of drugs out of the car window. At his trial, the Thompsons were convinced a senior Strathclyde detective had tampered with evidence to frame him. Their belief in their own power had grown so extreme that they plotted to kill the detective. Ferris was approached with a chilling request to park a car downtown rigged with explosives. After making an anonymous tip about drugs in the car, they planned for the detective to arrive, pry open the boot, and be met with a boom. Now, when I first read about this, I thought it sounded like something straight out of Scarface. And it seems Paul Ferris agreed, as he's been quoted saying, "We all have our legitimate grievances and, when necessary, proceed to apply our chosen methods of destruction." but a fatal incident of that nature would have brought us firmly into line with the Colombians. Amid the chaos and violence, Paul Ferris returned to his long-standing mission seeking revenge on the Welsh brothers. He described one particularly brutal encounter with Martin Welsh with his usual sense of dark humor. As Ferris recounted, while walking down Royston Road, he spotted Welsh across the street. Seizing the moment, Paul approached him, pulled out a Bowie knife, and grabbed Welsh by the hair. With a swift motion, he ran the blade across his scalp, stripping away more than just dandruff. Ferris noted with grim satisfaction that Welsh would be wearing a hat for quite some time, declaring at the end of both Welsh's scalp and finally the vendetta he had pursued for years. At still just 19, Paul Ferris inevitably found himself back in court, this time facing 4 charges of attempted murder. The incident stemmed from a mission handed to him by the Thompsons. He was tasked with shooting William Gibson, a hoodlum who had informed on Arthur Jr. Gibson, who had fled to England to escape prosecution for car ringing, mistakenly returned to Glasgow thinking the matter had been forgotten. When Ferris spotted Gibson in the city, he reported it to Arthur Thompson Sr, who promptly asked if Ferris was willing to kill him. Ferris agreed and was given a stolen Colt 45. As the Gibsons returned home from a night at the pub, Ferris and his group ambushed them. He aimed the Colt 45 directly at William Gibson, but Gibson pulled his female companion in front of him, using her as a human shield. A warning shot was fired, sending the family into panic. In the chaos, Gibson's brother leaped off the motorway bridge in an attempt to escape, meeting a sheer drop on the other side. More shots followed, with Gibson's cousin John Hogg being hit in the leg. Although charged with 4 attempted murders, Ferris was acquitted on a not-proven verdict, meaning the jury believed he might have been the perpetrator but lacked conclusive proof. As for Arthur Thompson Sr, the most feared gangster in Scotland for over 30 years, he died in 1993, not from an assassin's bullet, but from a heart attack, passing away peacefully at his home, the Ponderosa. His son, Arthur Jr, had not been so lucky. He was gunned down outside their family home just 2 years earlier, dying in his father's arms. It was an assassination that would later see Paul Ferris behind bars, accused of the murder. Arthur Thompson Jr, known as Arty to distinguish him from his father, was not a true gangster in his own right. Instead, he relied on his father's fearsome reputation to intimidate, bully, and terrorize those he believed had disrespected the family or himself. Short and wide, Arty flaunted flashy outfits, dressing like a Hollywood gangster, a style that earned him ridicule from real criminals of the time. In the newspapers, he was simply referred to as Fat Boy. Arty was killed on August 17, 1991, in a targeted assassination. He was shot 3 times while walking between the 2 adjacent council houses he shared with his father, Arthur Thompson Sr, on the Black Hill estate in Glasgow, which were known as the Ponderosa. The hit was carried out by a gunman later identified only as the Apprentice. Thompson Jr. had just left one of the houses and was walking toward the other when the shooter, lying in wait, ambushed him. He was shot twice in the head and once through the anus, traveling through his body and penetrating his heart. The fatal wounds led to his immediate death. The nature of the attack, a quick and precise execution, suggests it was a professional hit. As the Thompson family prepared to bury their notorious son, Arthur Jr., a deadly revenge plot was already in motion. Just 4 weeks after his assassination, the underworld sought its own brutal justice. Bobby Glover and Joe "Bananas" Hanlon, 2 Glasgow criminals suspected of being involved in Arthur's murder, met a violent end. On the morning of September 18, 1991, their lifeless, blood-stained bodies were discovered slumped in a car outside the Cottage Bar in Shettleston. Both men had been shot in the head and through the anus, a hit that later became known as a Glasgow send-off. Both of Joseph Hanlon and Bobby Glover's murders are also unsolved. They were shot on the night before Arthur Thompson Jr.'s funeral had left in Joseph Hanlon's car on Darleith Street, which was on a section of the route along which Arthur Thompson Jr.'s funeral cortege was to pass. In the criminal underworld, it was widely believed, and still is, that Paul Ferris was the one who pulled the trigger on Arthur Thompson Jr., with Bobby Glover and Joe "Bananas" Hanlon by his side that night. Whether the rumors held any truth or not, Hanlon and Glover paid the ultimate price for their alleged involvement, brutally executed just weeks after Thompson's death. Ferris, however, managed to avoid the same fate. Known for his relentless pursuit of power, he was out of reach for revenge, locked up in Shotts prison on remand for a kneecapping at the time. His incarceration shielded him from the violent retribution that claimed his supposed accomplices. Although Ferris says he cried uncontrollably when he found out about the death of his friends, he was no doubt kissing the 4 prison walls that surrounded his cell that night. After investigations, Paul Ferris was charged with the murder of Arthur Thompson Sr. in what became one of the most high-profile trials in Scottish legal history. Over 300 witnesses were called to give evidence during the 54-day trial, which cost £4 million, making it the longest and most expensive trial Scotland had ever seen at the time. Despite the prosecution's efforts, Ferris was acquitted of all charges. Following his acquittal, Ferris returned to Glasgow and set up a car dealership called Jagger Autos. He also became a consultant for Premier Security, a firm with an impressive annual turnover of £6.2 million. Despite his move into more legitimate businesses, Ferris maintained his connections in the criminal underworld, forging ties with figures such as Paul Massey and Rab Carruthers in northern England. In August 1994, Paul Ferris was fined £250 by a Manchester court after being charged with possession of crack cocaine. In his defense, Ferris told the court, "I'm no gangster," explaining that he used the drug to alleviate the symptoms of his psoriasis. Regardless of his claims, Ferris was steadily rising in the criminal underworld, with connections in both London and Manchester. However, to sustain his growing empire, he needed the heavy firepower that came with running such an operation. Ultimately, this would lead to his downfall. In 1997, after a 2-year surveillance operation involving MI5 and Special Branch, Ferris was arrested alongside notorious London gangster Henry Suddy. The pair were stopped by police in 2 unmarked cars on Upper Berkeley Street in Marylebone, central London. Inside their vehicle, officers discovered a cache of weapons, including 3 MAC-10 submachine guns, Uzi magazines, silencers, and dozens of rounds of blue-tipped and copper-jacketed 9mm ammunition, all hidden inside an Opal Fruits box. At his 1998 trial at the Old Bailey, Paul Ferris was sentenced to 10 years for conspiracy to sell weapons, firearms dealing, and possession of explosives. In May 1999, the Court of Appeal reduced his sentence to 7 years, but his gun-running activities had already marked the end of his criminal ascent. In May 2002, Ferris found himself back behind bars for breaching his parole after a violent altercation with former associate Tam, the licensee McGraw. The two, once lieutenants under Arthur Thompson, had arranged a meeting to settle an ongoing feud. Less than a mile from McGraw's home, the confrontation escalated into a knife fight, during which McGraw was also attacked with a golf club. Though he was wearing a bulletproof vest, McGraw walked away relatively unscathed despite reports of serious injuries. Tensions between the two had reached a boiling point after Ferris released his book Deadly Divisions a month earlier, in which he labeled McGraw as a police informant, a claim that reportedly enraged McGraw and his allies. While some believed the meeting was an attempt to resolve their differences, others speculated that Ferris was trying to reclaim territory he had lost during his time in prison, and McGraw wasn't about to let that happen. The Wee Man, a film based on Paul Ferris's life, was released in 2013, starring Martin Compston as Ferris and John Hannah as Tam McGraw. Directed by Ray Burtis, the film explores Ferris's rise in Glasgow's criminal underworld, his relationships with figures like Arthur Thompson Sr., and his eventual conflict with Tam McGraw. Though praised for its gritty portrayal, the film faced some criticism for allegedly glamorizing Ferris's criminal lifestyle. As of today, Paul Ferris has left behind his life of crime and focuses on more legitimate pursuits. He has written several books, including The Ferris Conspiracy and Vendetta, offering an inside look at his experiences in Glasgow's criminal underworld. He has also become a public speaker, using his past to educate others and steer people away from a life of crime. Though his legacy is controversial, Scotland's once most feared enforcer now aims to share his story as a cautionary tale. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into stories like Paul Ferris's, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for future content. Your support helps us continue bringing you insights into the lives of some of the world's most notorious figures. Until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.